On the morning of January 18, 1945, Friedrich Kunkel pressed his palm against the base of the Statue of Liberty and felt his entire world collapse. The metal was cold, solid, and unmistakably real. He had been searching for the seams in the plaster for 20 minutes. He had been certain it was a Hollywood prop for 3 years. And now his engineer's mind was running calculations he couldn't stop. 200,000 pounds of copper. Built in 1886. Still standing. His commanding officer at Camp Shanks had told him the Statue of Liberty was a hollow fraud, a tourist attraction made of painted plaster and wooden scaffolding. The Nazi propaganda leaflets had shown diagrams of its fake construction. Kunkel had believed them both. He had led 5 men in a midnight escape from a prison barge 72 hours earlier, convinced they would vanish into the darkened streets of a dying nation. And now he was standing on Liberty Island, touching enough copper to build 300 U-boats, realizing that Germany had already lost to a country so wealthy it could afford to waste metal on an idea. Colonel Jerry Hythe stood 10 feet away, watching Kunkel's hands shake against the weathered copper, and said nothing at all. It was January 14, 1945, when Kunkel gathered his escape committee in the corner of Barrack 7 at Camp Shanks, New Jersey. The 5 men sat on bunks in the weak afternoon light, and Kunkel unfolded a contraband map across his knees like a priest opening scripture. He pointed to the harbor marked in blue ink, then to the sprawling grid of Manhattan beyond. "Listen carefully," Kunkel said, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of a man who had never questioned his superiors. "Everything you see here is theater. The Americans are masters of illusion, just like Goebbels warned us. They built Hollywood to manufacture lies, and now they're using the same tricks on us." Gunther Hollenhorst leaned forward, studying the map. He was older than the others, a submariner like Kunkel, with the kind of tired eyes that came from too many depth charge attacks. "The food portions," he said quietly. "They're larger than what we ate in Hamburg before the war." "Exactly," Kunkel said, and his smile had the edge of vindication in it. "It's a temporary show. They're feeding us propaganda meals to break our spirits, to make us believe they have abundance when the truth is they're rationing just like everyone else. The guards let it slip yesterday. I heard them talking about throwing away an entire pot of stew. No nation with real abundance wastes food like that. They're performing for us." Lothar Wiedens shifted uncomfortably on his bunk. He was the youngest of the group, barely 23, and his doubt showed in the way he couldn't meet Kunkel's eyes. "What if it's real, Fritz? What if they actually have that much food?" The temperature in the corner dropped 10 degrees. Kunkel's expression hardened into something close to fury. "Then your family starved for nothing," he said, each word deliberate and cutting. "Then every man who died in Stalingrad was a fool. Is that what you want to believe?" Lothar looked down at his hands and said nothing. Kunkel pulled a folded propaganda leaflet from inside his jacket. The paper was worn thin from handling, the ink faded, but the diagram was still clear. It showed the Statue of Liberty in cross-section, labeled in German, hollow construction, wooden framework, plaster facade. He held it up like evidence in a trial. "This is what we're dealing with," he said. "A nation of liars who built a copper-colored monument out of paint and fraud. When we escape, you'll see the truth. The darkened streets. The ration lines. The desperation they're hiding from the newsreels." He looked at each man in turn, waiting for their nods of agreement. "We escape in 3 days, during the midnight transfer to the barge. And when we're free, when we see America as it really is, you'll understand why we're going to win this war." Before we continue with Friedrich Kunkel's story, I want to ask you something. Where in the world are you watching this from? Drop your country or city in the comments below. This channel exists to tell the untold stories of real people caught in history's most powerful moments, and your engagement, your likes, your shares, they help these forgotten stories reach the people who need to hear them. So hit that like button, tell me where you're from, and let's keep going. Because what happens next to Kunkel and his men will change everything they believe about the war. The next morning, Kunkel walked the perimeter of Camp Shanks with Gunther at his side, his engineer's mind cataloguing evidence like a prosecutor building a case. Every detail fed his theory. The guards leaned against fence posts with their rifles slung casual across their shoulders, smoking cigarettes and laughing at jokes Kunkel couldn't hear. In Germany, such relaxation would earn a soldier 6 weeks of punishment detail. Here, it was standard procedure. "Look at them," Kunkel muttered, nodding toward a young private who was reading a comic book while technically on duty. "Poorly trained. Undisciplined. They're not real soldiers. They're actors playing soldiers for our benefit." Gunther said nothing, but his silence felt heavier than agreement. They passed the mess hall just as the kitchen staff wheeled out 3 garbage cans to the collection area behind the building. Kunkel stopped walking. The cans were overflowing with food scraps, half-eaten bread rolls, entire portions of what looked like beef stew dumped directly into the waste. He stared at it with the intensity of a man seeing proof of conspiracy. In Hamburg, his mother had made soup from potato peels. Here, they were throwing away meat. "We must be near a film studio," Kunkel said, his voice tight with vindication. "This is set dressing. They're creating the illusion of abundance for the newsreel cameras. No nation wastes food like this unless they're performing for an audience." Gunther crouched down beside one of the garbage cans and lifted the lid. The smell of wasted gravy hit them both. He let the lid fall back with a metallic clang and stood up slowly, brushing his hands on his trousers. "Fritz, what if this is just how they live? What if they actually have so much food that they can afford to throw it away?" The question hung in the cold January air between them like smoke. Kunkel turned on him with the kind of fury that came from fear. "Then we're fighting an enemy that can outproduce us 10-1. Then every torpedo we built, every ship we sank, every city we defended was meaningless from the start. Is that what you want to believe, Gunther? That we were doomed before we even began?" Gunther looked at his friend for a long moment, and Kunkel saw something shift behind his eyes. Not agreement. Not defiance. Just a quiet, terrible sadness. Before Gunther could answer, Sergeant Bill Waters appeared around the corner of the mess hall, a cigarette dangling from his lips and a second one held out in offering. He was in his 50s, with the kind of comfortable gut that came from regular meals and the easy smile of a man who had never missed one. "You boys look like you could use a smoke," Waters said, his accent thick with something Kunkel thought might be Texas. Kunkel stepped back as if the cigarette were a weapon. "No, thank you." Waters shrugged and tucked the extra cigarette behind his ear. "Suit yourself. But if you're planning what I think you're planning, you might want to reconsider. It's a long swim to anywhere worth going." He walked away whistling something that sounded like a cowboy song, and Kunkel watched him go with his jaw clenched tight. Psychological manipulation. The friendly guard routine was textbook interrogation technique. They were trying to soften him up, make him compliant, trick him into believing their performance. That night, Kunkel lay in his bunk and stared at the ceiling where a single electric bulb burned bright and wasteful through the darkness. In Germany, lights out meant total blackout. Here, they left the bulbs burning all night long as if electricity cost nothing at all. He smiled in the dark. They were getting sloppy with their theater. The generator for this camp must be massive. Probably the only one in the whole region, running at full capacity just to maintain the illusion for a few hundred prisoners. 3 more days, he thought. 3 more days and he would see the truth behind the stage lights. On the evening of January 16th, Kunkel stood near the mess hall loading dock and heard the proof he'd been waiting for. 2 guards were arguing just around the corner, their voices carrying clear in the winter air. The older one was insisting they had to throw away an entire pot of beef stew because it had been sitting out for 3 hours past regulation time. The younger one called it a waste. The older one said regulations were regulations, and the pot went into the garbage with a heavy, liquid thump that made Kunkel's heart race. 3 hours past regulation. They had rules about food waste timing. That meant scarcity protocols. That meant rationing systems they were trying to hide behind theatrical abundance. He found the others in the barracks 20 minutes later and spread his contraband map across Lowther's bunk with hands that trembled with vindication. "We go tomorrow night," he said. "During the midnight transfer to the barge." The plan unfolded from his mind like a blueprint. They would be moved in groups of 10, hands bound with canvas restraints, loaded onto a transport truck for the 15-minute drive to the Hudson River docks. The barge would be waiting, dark and low in the water, ready to take them south to a longer-term facility. But between the truck and the barge, there would be a moment, perhaps 90 seconds, when they would walk across an exposed dock with only 2 guards flanking them. Kunkel had stolen a sharpened piece of metal from the machine shop 3 days earlier. He demonstrated how it would slice through canvas in one smooth motion. Gunther would cut his own restraints first, then Lothar's, then the others in sequence. The guards would be watching the front of the line. By the time they noticed movement at the back, all 5 men would be free and running for the edge of the dock. The East River, Kunkel said, tracing the blue line on his map. We swim to the far bank, maybe 200 meters. Then we move inland to the streets. They'll be dark because of the blackout protocols the Americans are hiding. We'll disappear into the shadows before they can organize a proper search. Emil Roibke sat on the edge of his bunk, his knee bouncing with nervous energy he was trying to pass off as excitement. He was the youngest after Lothar, barely 22, with a kind of thin frame that came from growing up hungry. "And if the streets aren't dark?" he asked, then immediately tried to cover the doubt with a laugh. "Not that they won't be. I'm just asking what the backup plan is." Kunkel looked at him with the patience of a teacher correcting a slow student. "They will be dark, Emil. We've been over this. No nation can sustain this level of electrical waste across an entire city. The lights here are localized to the camp. Once we're beyond their theater radius, we'll find the real America." The 5 men sat in the dim barracks as evening count was called outside. Kunkel could feel their fear and excitement mixing into something combustible. This was the moment that would define them, the moment they would break free from the American illusion and see the truth behind the propaganda. He extended his hand palm down in the center of their circle. Gunther placed his hand on top, then Lothar, then Emil, then finally Johann Karlmeyer, the quiet one who had barely spoken since they'd formed the committee. 5 hands stacked in the darkness, 5 men committed to the same desperate faith. "Tomorrow night," Kunkel said, "we go home." The East River in January felt like knives against Kunkel's skin. He hit the water at 11:47 p.m. on January 17th, and the cold drove every thought from his mind except the animal need to reach air. Behind him, he heard 4 more splashes as the others followed, and then the shouts of guards discovering empty restraints on the barge deck. The swim took 3 minutes that felt like 30. Kunkel's lungs burned. His fingers went numb around the dock piling he grabbed, and Gunther had to help pull him up onto the wooden platform because his legs wouldn't quite obey commands anymore. They lay there gasping and shivering, 5 men dripping river water onto American soil, and for one perfect moment Kunkel felt the pure triumph of freedom. Then he looked up. The city blazed. Not with searchlights sweeping for escaped prisoners, not with military floodlights illuminating a secure perimeter, but with ordinary, casual, wasteful light. Street lamps marched down the avenue in perfect rows, each one burning bright enough to read by. Apartment windows glowed warm and yellow on every floor of every building. A neon sign 3 blocks away advertised something called Coca-Cola in letters 6 feet tall. Car headlights swept past on the street above them, and none of them dimmed or covered for blackout protocols. Kunkel stared at it with water still streaming from his hair and felt something cold that had nothing to do with the river settle into his chest. "It's a show for the docks," he said, his voice shaking from more than cold. "Once we get inland, past their theater radius, we'll find the real streets." They climbed the embankment and stumbled onto the sidewalk like drowned men walking into heaven's spotlight. The light was everywhere. It reflected off the wet pavement and the chrome bumpers of parked cars and the glass storefronts that lined the street. Every window was bright. Every doorway was visible. There were no shadows deep enough to hide in, no darkness to vanish into, nothing but light stretching block after endless block into a distance Kunkel couldn't process. They walked 4 blocks inland before Emil's legs gave out and he sat down hard on the curb. Kunkel stood in the middle of the illuminated street, turning slowly in a circle, searching desperately for the darkness that had to be there, that must be there, that his entire understanding of the world required to be there. But the lights just kept burning, and burning, and burning. Sergeant Bill Waters found them 40 minutes later, huddled in an alley between a bakery and a hardware store, shivering so hard their teeth clattered like machine gun fire. He didn't draw his weapon. He didn't blow a whistle or call for backup. He just stood at the alley entrance with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at them the way a man might look at wet dogs who'd gotten loose from the yard. "You boys hungry?" Waters asked. Kunkel tried to stand, but his legs were still shaking from the cold and the walk. He managed to get upright by using the brick wall for support. Waters knew what they had done. He pulled a thermos from inside his coat and unscrewed the cap. The smell of real coffee drifted across the alley, the kind of coffee Kunkel hadn't tasted since 1942. "Son, you can't escape from a whole continent," Waters said, pouring himself a cup. "And you especially can't do it soaking wet in January wearing prison uniforms. You're about as inconspicuous as a brass band at a funeral." He took a sip of coffee and looked at them with something that might have been sympathy or might have been second-hand embarrassment. "Come on. I'll walk you back before you catch pneumonia and make me fill out medical paperwork." The humiliation of it burned hotter than the cold. Kunkel wanted to argue, to fight, to do anything except be pitted by a middle-aged military policeman who treated their grand escape like a minor inconvenience. But his body was done. His mind was done. And when Waters offered him the thermos, Kunkel took it and drank coffee that tasted better than anything he'd had in 3 years. They walked back through 12 blocks of blazing light. Past restaurants with full tables visible through windows. Past shops with their displays lit up like Christmas. Past cars and buses and taxis that burned gasoline without apparent concern for rationing. Waters walked beside them with his hands in his pockets, occasionally nodding to other pedestrians who didn't seem particularly alarmed by the sight of 5 soaking wet German prisoners being escorted down the street. "You boys sure picked the wrong harbor," Waters said conversationally as they approached the waterfront. "Liberty's gonna be lit up tonight for some Navy thing. Should be pretty from a distance, if you like that sort of thing." Kunkel said nothing. He had stopped trying to make sense of what he was seeing and had retreated into the numb silence of a man whose calculations had all come back wrong. Colonel Jerry Hythe sat behind his desk at the processing center with their escape report spread in front of him like a disappointing school assignment. He was in his late 40s, with a kind of trim military bearing that suggested he'd spent more time behind desks than in foxholes, and when he looked up at the 5 shivering prisoners standing in his office, his expression was unreadable. 4 blocks, Hythe said, tapping the report with one finger. "You made it 4 blocks before Sergeant Waters found you sitting in an alley. That might be a new record for shortest escape attempt in this facility's history." Kunkel stood at attention despite his wet clothes and chattering teeth, trying to salvage some dignity from the wreckage of the night. He waited for the punishment, for the solitary confinement or the reduction in rations or whatever creative discipline the Americans had devised for escape attempts. Instead, Hythe leaned back in his chair and smiled. It wasn't a cruel smile or a mocking one. It was almost gentle, which somehow made it worse. "I'm ordering an educational excursion," he said. "Tomorrow morning at dawn, you 5 will be taken by ferry to Liberty Island. You'll be given a tour of the monument and the grounds, and then you'll be returned to processing for transfer to a work camp in Pennsylvania." The words hit Kunkel like a physical blow. Propaganda theater. Newsreel cameras. A carefully staged re-education designed to break their spirits and film their surrender for American audiences. His paranoia crystallized into certainty. "We don't need your American propaganda tour," he said, his English sharp with anger. "We know what the statue is. We know it's plaster and wooden framework built for tourists and cameras." Hythe's smile didn't waver. "Humor me, Kunkel. Let's see if you still think it's plaster when you're standing underneath it." They spent that night in a holding cell with clean bunks and blankets that were somehow softer than anything they'd slept on in the camp. Kunkel sat on the edge of his bunk and briefed the others in whispered German, his voice carrying the intensity of a final mission briefing. "Tomorrow they'll try to break us with their theater. Look for the seams in the construction. Look for the places where they've bolted the framework together. Don't let them convince you with their stage props and camera tricks." Gunther and Emil nodded. Johann stared at the ceiling. But Lothar sat with his back against the wall and his knees pulled up to his chest, and after a long silence he spoke so quietly Kunkel almost didn't hear him. "Fritz, what if we're wrong about all of this? The question hung in the dark cell like smoke. Kunkel turned on him with fury rising hot in his chest. Then every man who died for the fatherland was a fool and every sacrifice was meaningless. Is that what you want to believe? Lothar looked at his hands and said nothing more. But later, when the others were asleep, Kunkel lay awake and stared at the ceiling and felt the smallest seed of doubt take root somewhere deep in his mind where he couldn't quite reach it to pull it out. The ferry cut through the harbour at dawn on January 18th with Kunkel and his 4 companions sitting on the wooden benches, their hands bound loosely with canvas restraints. Colonel Hythe sat across from them, silent and watching. Through the salt-sprayed windows, the Statue of Liberty grew larger with each passing minute, rising from the morning mist like something from a fever dream. Kunkel leaned toward Günther and began his narration in German, his voice carrying the desperate certainty of a man clinging to faith. See the base. That's where they'll have hidden the main support framework. The statue itself will be hollow, probably chicken wire and plaster over a wooden skeleton. Look for the seams where the sections join together. They'll have tried to hide them with paint, but you can always see the joints if you know what to look for. But even as he spoke, the scale was becoming impossible to reconcile with his theory. The statue was enormous. Not moviset enormous. Not clever angles and forced perspective enormous. Just genuinely, physically, impossibly enormous in a way that made his engineer's brain start running numbers he didn't want to calculate. The ferry docked and Hythe led them down the gangway onto Liberty Island. They walked across the grounds toward the monument, and with every step the statue grew larger overhead until Kunkel had to tilt his head back to see the torch. His neck ached from the angle. His mind kept trying to estimate the height, the volume, the material requirements, and every calculation came back wrong for plaster. Hythe stopped them at the base and nodded to the guard, who cut Kunkel's restraints. Go ahead, Hythe said quietly. Touch it. Kunkel approached the way a man might approach a snake he suspected was dead but couldn't be certain. He reached out slowly and pressed his palm against the surface. The metal was cold and solid and unmistakably real. The oxidation had turned it green in the way only real copper turned green after decades of weathering. His fingers traced the seams, but they weren't construction joints. They were the riveted plates of actual metalwork, the kind of engineering that required massive industrial capacity and precision manufacturing. His mind started calculating before he could stop it. The surface area, the thickness of the plating, the weight per square meter. 200,000 pounds of copper, maybe more. Built in 1886 according to the plaque his eyes found without wanting to. Nearly 60 years standing in this harbour while Europe had fought 2 wars and melted down every spare gram of metal for bullets and shell casings. The calculation crashed through his mind like a depth charge. While his grandmother had been collecting copper pots for the Kaiser's war effort in 1914, this statue had already been standing here for 28 years. While he'd been building torpedoes from recycled metal in 1943, this monument had been standing here untouched, unneeded, unwanted for anything except the idea it represented. A nation that could afford to leave 200,000 pounds of copper standing in a harbour for 60 years just to represent a concept had already won. Not recently. Not barely. Not by clever strategy or lucky timing. They had won before the war even started, before the first shot was fired, before the first propaganda poster was printed. Kunkel stood with his hand pressed against the cold copper and felt the mathematical certainty of Germany's defeat settle into his bones like the January cold. Kunkel walked the perimeter of the monument's base like a man searching for an exit that didn't exist. His movements were mechanical, automatic, his engineer's mind still trying to solve the problem even though the solution had already announced itself with devastating clarity. He traced the rivets with his fingers, looking for the place where plaster met framework, where Hollywood illusion gave way to structural truth. But there was only copper, solid and real and impossible to deny. Günther stood 10 feet away and watched his friend unravel with the quiet concern of a man witnessing something he couldn't prevent. Hythe leaned against a lamppost near the entrance, his arms crossed, his expression neutral. He wasn't gloating. He wasn't smiling. He was just letting them look, letting them see, letting the monument speak for itself in the language of mathematics and industrial capacity that couldn't be faked or staged or explained away. Kunkel's knees gave out halfway around the perimeter. One moment he was walking, and the next he was sitting on the cold stone plaza with his back against the monument's base, staring out at New York Harbor. The morning sun was burning off the mist, revealing the city beyond in harsh, undeniable detail. Skyscrapers that rose higher than any building in Berlin. Ships moving through the harbor with the casual efficiency of a nation that had never known fuel shortages. The bridges spanning impossible distances with the kind of engineering that required resources Germany had been rationing since 1940. Gunther walked over slowly and sat down beside him. He didn't say anything. He just placed one hand on Kunkel's shoulder and left it there, a silent acknowledgement that they were both seeing the same truth and there was nothing left to say about it. Across the plaza, Emil was crying. Not sobbing, not making any sound at all, just tears running down his face while he stared up at the torch overhead. Lothar sat with his head in his hands. Johann stood alone at the railing, looking out at the harbor, his shoulders rigid with the kind of tension that came from holding together something that had already broken. The silence stretched across Liberty Island like a physical weight. 5 men who had believed so completely in the lies they'd been told that they'd risked their lives to escape, now sitting in the wreckage of their faith with nothing left but the cold stone beneath them and the mathematical certainty that every sacrifice had been for nothing. Hythe pushed off from the lamppost and walked toward them slowly. He stopped a respectful distance away and waited until Kunkel looked up at him. "I'm not trying to break you, Kunkel," he said quietly. "I'm trying to give you the truth so you can go home someday." Kunkel looked at him with eyes that had seen too much in the past 12 hours. Home. The word felt foreign now, like something from a language he'd forgotten how to speak. What home was there to return to? The Germany he'd believed in had never existed. The war he'd fought had been lost before it began. The truth he'd defended had been the greatest lie of all. He turned back to the harbor and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say. The return ferry cut through the harbor with 5 silent men sitting on the wooden benches, their canvas restraints loose around their wrists. Hythe produced a thermos of coffee and a paper bag of Navy-issue donuts, the kind with powdered sugar that got everywhere when you bit into them. He offered them around without ceremony, and Kunkel took one mechanically, biting into it without tasting anything at all. The sugar dissolved on his tongue like ash. None of them spoke. What was there to say? The monument behind them had said everything that needed saying in the language of copper and mathematics and industrial capacity. They had touched the truth with their own hands and found it solid and cold and immovable as the stone it stood upon. The city skyline passed by the ferry windows, still blazing with casual abundance even in the morning light. Kunkel watched it without seeing it, his mind somewhere else entirely, running through memories of every propaganda poster he'd believed, every speech he'd memorized, every sacrifice he justified with the certainty that Germany was fighting a dying giant. The math had always been there if he'd wanted to see it. He just hadn't wanted to see it. When they docked at the processing center, Hythe cut their restraints and walked them inside to the transfer office. A clerk handed him a stack of papers and Hythe signed them with quick, efficient movements. "You'll be transferred to a work camp in Pennsylvania," he said, not unkindly. "Farm labor mostly. The food's good and the barracks are warm. The war will be over soon, and then you can go home." Kunkel nodded because nodding was easier than explaining that he had no home to return to. The Germany he believed in had never existed outside of Goebbels' speeches and his own desperate need to believe the sacrifices meant something. They loaded into a covered transport truck an hour later, sitting on benches that ran along both sides of the cargo bed. The engine rumbled to life and the truck pulled out of the processing center, heading west toward Pennsylvania and a future Kunkel couldn't quite imagine yet. Through the gap in the canvas cover, he could see the city passing by, block after block of buildings and lights and casual American abundance that would have fed his entire hometown for a year. Lothar sat across from him, staring at his hands. After 20 minutes of silence, he looked up and asked the question they were all thinking. "What do we do now, Fritz?" Kunkel looked down at his own hands, calloused and scarred from 3 years of building torpedoes in the U-boat factories. Hands that had constructed weapons for a war that had been lost before it began, for a cause that had been built on lies so complete he'd mistaken them for truth. He'd been so certain, so absolutely convinced of his own clear-sightedness, that he'd become the most thoroughly blind man in the camp. "We survive," he said finally, his voice quiet but steady. "That's all that's left." The truck rolled on through the American morning, carrying 5 men who had escaped into freedom only to discover they'd been prisoners of something far more confining than canvas restraints and barbed wire fences. They'd been prisoners of their own certainty, and the bars of that cage had been made of propaganda and pride and the desperate human need to believe that suffering must have meaning. Kunkel leaned his head back against the truck's wooden frame and closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he could still see the monument standing in the harbor, 200,000 pounds of copper left to weather and oxidize for 60 years just to represent an idea. And he understood now, too late to matter, that the greatest propaganda hadn't come from America at all. It had come from the voice in his own head that had told him what he needed to hear to keep fighting, keep believing, keep building torpedoes for a war that mathematics had already decided. When he opened his eyes again, he caught his reflection in the truck side mirror. The face staring back at him looked like a stranger, and maybe that was fitting. The man who had led 5 prisoners in an escape 3 days ago no longer existed. That man had died on Liberty Island, killed not by American soldiers but by the simple, devastating truth of oxidized copper and honest mathematics. The truck carried them west into Pennsylvania, into survival, into whatever came after certainty collapsed and left only the hard work of learning to see clearly. This story has circulated for years, often presented as fact. But historians have never been able to verify it. No records exist of Friedrich Kunkel or this specific escape attempt from Campshanks in January 1945. Nevertheless, the emotional truth at its core is historically sound. Thousands of German POWs held in America during World War II experienced a similar psychological shock when confronted with American industrial capacity. Many had been raised on propaganda that portrayed the United States as a weak, decadent nation on the verge of collapse, only to find themselves in camps with better food than they'd eaten in Germany, surrounded by the casual abundance of a nation that had never known strategic bombing or severe rationing. The cognitive dissonance was real. The propaganda was real. And the moment when belief collided with evidence was, for many prisoners, as devastating as any battlefield defeat. Some POWs returned to Germany after the war and became important voices for reconciliation and democracy, precisely because they had seen with their own eyes what a free, industrial society could accomplish. The lesson here isn't about Germany or America specifically. It's about the danger of constructing your identity around beliefs that you've never tested against reality. It's about how propaganda works not by forcing you to believe lies, but by telling you the lies you already want to believe because they make your suffering meaningful. And it's about the courage required to change your mind when the evidence demands it, even when changing your mind means admitting that everything you sacrificed was for nothing. The hardest prison to escape isn't made of wire and walls. It's made of certainty. If this story made you think, if it challenged you, or if it reminded you of the veterans in your own family who carried these complicated truths home with them, do me a favor. Hit that like button and share this video. Your engagement is what pushes stories like this, the ones that don't get told in textbooks, out to the people who need to hear them. And drop a comment below. Tell me where you're watching from, or tell me about the veterans in your life who understood what it meant to have their certainty shaken. These stories matter. Your engagement makes sure they don't get forgotten. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.